Welcome to our webinar today on Pathways for EngageNY. My colleagues Lisa Siebelek, Jack Humstetter, and myself will be speaking with you about ways to support your implementation of the new New York State Math and ELA modules for the Common Core. Please follow along with us, if you would, on the social media of your choice. We have a website dedicated just to your needs at www.leadandlearn.com/EngageNY. You can also like us on Facebook at the address that you see there, and you'll be able to download this recording and come back to it later. And please follow us on Twitter at WeCanEngageNY. I'd like to take a moment and introduce my colleagues, our presenters today. We have with us Lisa Siebelek. Lisa is a professional development associate with the Leadership and Learning Center. Before joining the center, she was a secondary literacy coach in her district while continuing to teach English language arts courses. Lisa is our Common Core ELA specialist and has contributed to both our Common Core ELA series and is the co-creator of our Core Literacy Seminar on reading and writing strategies for all teachers. She's also authored chapters for navigating the English language arts Common Core standards. Lisa is a lifelong learner and has participated in extensive literacy coaching and has been trained in cognitive coaching. She has presented at the state and national level, including ASCD, and has worked on multiple projects, including a partnership with the Ball Foundation and the National Council of Teachers of English in support of teachers using data to drive their instruction. She is also certified in Writing to Learn and Power Strategies for Effective Teaching and is able to share instructional strategies across the content areas. Jack Humstetter is a professional development associate with the Leadership and Learning Center. Jack has been an educator and facilitator in the Long Island, New York area, and as such, he's taught all grades from kindergarten through graduate school. He served as a high school assistant principal and English department chair, and he oversaw state assessment scoring in his district, as well as coaching several academic teams. Jack is the author of more than a dozen teacher resources in the field of literacy and has written for the History Channel and Newsday. He's been included in Contemporary Authors and Who's Who Among America's Teachers. For the past 6 years, Jack has been a national keynote speaker, a K-12 workshop presenter, coach, consultant, and has designed, implemented, and delivered many sessions on various educational topics and learning strategies. And myself, Tony Flock, I have been a professional development associate with the Leadership and Learning Center for 10 years now. Prior to that, I was with Norfolk Public Schools in Norfolk, Virginia, and was a part of the team that helped the system win the Broad Foundation Prize for the best urban school system in the district. And it will be more than happy to share the great practices that we used in the district. It really hats off to the teachers and leaders in Norfolk Public Schools for making that happen. So, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for responding to our poll. We asked you how familiar you are with the new New York State curriculum modules for Common Core, and you see the results here on your screen. Not surprisingly, it's kind of a good old bell curve, with fortunately very few of you saying that you don't know about those modules. The bulk of you saying that you have reviewed those modules in great detail, but almost equal distribution of those who have heard of them but haven't reviewed them, and those that have reviewed the modules in great detail. So we will do our best throughout the balance of this webinar to speak to all of the groups in each of your needs as you go through. What we're going to talk to you today about, folks, are some pathways to help you achieve 3 of the big areas of focus for EngageNY. Lisa will be speaking with you about Common Core curriculum and assessments, some questions to consider in your current practice. Are you implementing the EngageNY modules, or are you developing your own curriculum? Lisa will speak to tips and best practices regardless of which approach you're taking, and she'll also speak with you about some ways to align your existing resources with EngageNY. I'll be speaking with you today about data-driven instruction, particularly focusing on processes and structures for meaningful data-driven instruction, and helping you reflect on whether or not you're creating high-quality assessments to provide the right data for educators to analyze. And rounding out our day, Jack will be speaking with you about teacher and leader effectiveness, questions to consider during this session are the degree to which apologize, folks, technical difficulties. There we go. The degree to which we're providing training for leaders or coaches so that they can give practical, specific next steps to educators in order to be successful on the new evaluation instruments that New York State is using. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Siebelak, to speak to us about Common Core curriculum and assessments. Lisa.
Hey, thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about our first pathway, although there's 3 pathways Tony just talked about, and you might be coming into it at a different angle, a different pathway, but the first one we're going to talk about here is the Common Core curriculum and assessments. So you can go ahead to the next slide, Tony. What I want you to think about is a couple questions for you. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to have you read this quote just for a moment. And as you can see, the Common Core really calls for that. It must be partnered with a content-rich curriculum and robust assessments, and that all aligns to the standards. So what the Common Core state standards give us are the outcomes, the actual standards. That's it. The Common Core state standards are not a curriculum. It's not telling us how to teach. That is a misconception out there. It does not tell us that. And it's not giving us the assessments, although we do have Smarter, Balance, and Park on the way. But we also need to create assessments in the classroom and to be able to use for our own data-enriched learning. But we need to make sure it all lines up to the standards. So with that in mind, I'm going to take the conversation first to curriculum and really think about what are your needs as a school district. So there's some questions that I would ask you that get you kind of thinking here, pre-assessment if you would, and to say, what's the current state of your existing curricula? I might follow that up with, now, why should you consider revising or updating these curricula now? And with that question in mind, of course, is, well, the Common Core. It's here and we're implementing, and we need to revise and or update our curriculum. And so with that in mind, we'll talk about resources and how to do that. But we also want to talk about now is all the content areas, are they in need of equal revision, or do you need to prioritize certain ones? And that's why across the country right now we see the prioritized needs for ELA and Math, which is why it's really beneficial for you there in New York to have those ELA and Math modules to help pull from and use those as great resources. And then another question is, to what degree does your school system, really need to undertake this work? Some of you are there already, have a lot to work from, have your resources. You're pulling from the EngageNY ELA modules, and you just need some tweaks and fine-tuning, or to go ahead and work in data, or to, as Jack will talk to you about, some instructional learning. More of that how, the strategies. How are we going to get there? But for some of us, we have to backtrack here and start with curriculum. So we have something called a rigorous curriculum, and it's a process, and that's what I love about it. It's not a commercial program or anything like that, but it takes you wherever you're at. And so some of you are starting from scratch. Some of you are using the EngageNY ELA modules to help build your curriculum, and some of you are doing a little bit of everything and using your own resources and what you have to pull in as well. And that's okay. That's what's great about this rigorous curriculum, is you take it from wherever you're at. So when I say rigorous curriculum, and that's Larry Ainsworth's work here at the center, what we're talking about is a set of intentionally aligned components. So what we're doing is really taking these clear learning outcomes and make sure we have matching assessments, engaging learning experiences. For those of you in the poll, it said a lot of you have looked at the modules already, so you're seeing performance tasks, and that's the key there. Instructional strategies, tying it all together into these organized sequence units of study so that you have this roadmap and able to get to the desired end in mind of what we want these outcomes for students to be and how to get there. So we're really pulling it all together. And how we can help you do that with those of you who are pulling your pieces together and using the EngageNY ELA modules is to say, first of all, the first thing that they talk about is that the curriculum decisions are made at the local level. So those modules can be really helpful for you and a big part of what you do. But you might have to depend more on the resources you have at your own school. It might be that some of the material you don't feel is quite the perfect fit for your particular grade level. Or it might be that they list a lot of practices, and when Jack talks about instructional strategies later, it might be to say now, okay, here's a list of really good strategies, but which one fits best with which module, and how can we go deeper into it and really help our teachers get to the how to teach it part, because that's so needed when we need to change our instruction. So with our curriculum design, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a program, but it's really incremental steps being placed together depending on where you're at and fitting the pieces together. So with that, I do want to talk about a few things, and we talk about making sure everything goes back to the standards, but especially we have to weed our garden, so that means going back to those priority standards. And that is so, so very key. And when we talk about data teams, which is coming up with Tony, we're going to talk about the power and the importance of starting from the start line, really going back to the basics and saying, what are our priority standards? And what we're finding across the country in our work with the Common Core, ELA, doesn't matter if it's ELA or math, but there's still teachers who are not sure about the standards. They haven't looked at them deeply. Too many teachers have been given the standards and say, okay, there you go, start with it, and they look at the grade level, but they don't have quite the experience of really understanding those standards. So we start with the priority standards, we unwrap them, we talk about big ideas, essential questions. That's what's great with some of the quality of this EngageNY ELA modules. You'll see big ideas for you to go on, but you also see broad big ideas. So we're also going to talk about how to bring in topical big ideas, essential questions to make sure they go back to those standards. We'll talk about engaging learning experiences, how to gather your resource materials, have a unit planning organizer, create informal progress and monitoring checks for that feedback, and then gets down to then where the teachers, we leave it to them to write those lesson plans to fit the framework that we have in place. Hey, Tony, if you want to go ahead and click on, we'll see the next slide here is implementing those ELA modules that a lot of you looks like you've really looked at, or at least to some degree. What you'll see is the material that I'm talking about here, and you'll see with the Common Core, you'll see the equal weight on the reading and the writing. And you'll see that not only come through in the modules, but on the assessments created that will come with them. So we really want to make sure that you're really all set and working and pulling those pieces together so that you can then adopt or adapt, I should say, for your purposes. Because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, and you are going to need to prioritize based on your own student needs and where they're at. And so with that, you go ahead to the next slide, Tony, and you'll see math, but if you'll notice, you'll see pencils on the math slide. So with that in mind, we still have to work on the math and the math formulas and math numbers and do all those things, but here's a key shift coming. Is the writing that happens in math. We need some constructed responses. We need that conceptual understanding. So another way to take the math modules and to have us help you fit in your curriculum or run data teams, or as Jack's going to talk about, those instructional practices, is to think about those 8 mathematical practices and where are we going to place them, in what unit, in what module would they go in. How are we going to get our students to start thinking more conceptually? So with those math practices, it's so important that in every lesson, every day, there's at least one math practice being taught in all of those. And so with that comes our constructed response to get students thinking, to justify their answers, and to have that critical thinking process still in place. So a little bit about the ELA, a little bit about math, but really this question you see here on this slide is to say now, how are we going to get our students to meet these rigorous expectations? And with that, what we're seeing is the higher level thinking skills. So if you think about Bloom's taxonomy and you're going up the Bloom's taxonomy, when we unwrap those standards, we're seeing the skill set really at a higher level than before, than most of our state standards have been in the past. So we have to have our students thinking about their thinking. There has to be that metacognition in place. And the thing that we do at the center, I think, so successfully is when we're talking about curriculum and assessments, we have a holistic approach. So we can't talk about data teams if we're not talking about the standards, and we're not talking about the standards if we're not talking about how we're assessing them, and we can't really talk about assessing them if we leave out the whole instructional piece. How are we going to teach it? How are we going to change our instruction? So with that, I'm going to leave that a little bit about the curriculum assessment, which leads really right into Tony's piece coming up here on data teams.
Thanks,
Tony?
Lisa. So folks, appreciate it. What's important to keep in mind is, as you're thinking about how to implement these resources, is that, as Lisa has described, all of the pieces go together, and it's really difficult to do one without the other. However, you have to pick a place to start. So think about the current needs of your building. What are you good at? What do you need to get better at? And concentrate on those areas. So Lisa's absolutely right. We cannot have data-driven instruction without a good understanding of the standards. But as I say down my way in North Carolina, sometimes you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Here's a great place where sometimes we can do a bunch of standards work, but it is not until teachers start to analyze student assessments related to those standards that they really realize they begin to need to understand those standards at a deep level so they know how best to teach. There may be times where teams realize, you know what, we've got to understand the standards first before we can design or select meaningful assessments. Or we've got to deliver some instruction and then think about how to measure the effectiveness of that instruction. And so there's no one, as the name suggests, there's no single pathway to reaching the Common Core standards. But think about all of these as ways to do it. My section focuses on data-driven instruction, and it is literally here that we will move students to mastery of all of the new standards that we are facing. Teachers, principals, and students, all reflecting on what it is they know and can do and what it is they need to do better. So the center of all of this, folks, this is all about school improvement. And this data-driven instruction brings together the four major areas of school improvement. As Lisa just described, we have to understand those standards very deeply to know what it is our kids are expected to be able to understand and to do in all of the subject areas, math and ELA to begin with, but as we expand to the next generation science standards and the other subjects. It's here in data-driven instruction that we really need to understand how assessment can help us truly determine our current level of mastery, of skills, and knowledge on the part of our students so that we can make better instructional decisions. All of this has to be done through a process of collaboration where we build a common understanding of those standards, where we collectively design meaningful assessments that are going to give us appropriate information upon which we base our instructional decisions. And this last piece, folks, is really critical. We literally cannot afford for teachers to be independent practitioners anymore. We have to apply our collective wisdom to the needs that we see in our students and think about those best instructional practices to respond to the needs. Just as the best doctors and lawyers work in teams to think about how to respond to the needs of their clients or their patients, same thing here for our teachers. Now, folks, what we're talking about are data-based inquiry teams, and there are definite steps that these teams go through. What we've noticed in our time in the field, both in New York and in other states, is that the most effective data-based inquiry teams, what we would call data teams, follow a series of very specific steps when they've administered a common formative assessment and need to make decisions based on the results they find from those assessments. You see the steps here on the screen. And it begins with charting the data, so what do the numbers tell us about where we are right now? But what's interesting, folks, is even though we call these data-based inquiry teams or data teams, the data is not just the numbers. We have to actually have student work samples from those assessments in order to really determine our student strengths and deficits that we're going to address. So it's not just the data, but an analysis of those actual work samples that's critical. Once we've analyzed the needs and prioritized them for each of the groups of students that we have, those that are proficient already, those that are close, those that are far from proficient, and those that are probably going to need intervention, those are the titles that we use. You certainly call them anything that you'd like. We have to prioritize the needs for each of those groups and then establish a goal for performance by the end of the unit of instruction. Where is it we need to be? From that point then, folks, we think about and collectively determine which instructional practices will be best in order to respond to the needs of each of those groups of students. This is the prescription for the needs that we diagnosed back in Step 2. Once we've selected those strategies in Step 5, results indicators, then we need to talk about exactly what that practice is going to look like in our classrooms. The purpose of that is to ensure fidelity of implementation, as well as to provide short-term monitoring indicators so that we can adjust our practice as we need throughout the unit of instruction. Then outside that circle, folks, is the ongoing process of monitoring. This is monitoring both by the database inquiry team or by instructional coaches or principals outside of the team in order to provide us feedback on our practices and the degree to which those practices are successful, so that we can ensure we hit our goals. This is collaboration top to bottom, not gotcha, not any kind of negative accountability system, but everybody working together in order to meet the needs of our kids. Now, what's interesting, looking at the resources available to you there in Engage New York, we found that most effective teams actually add a few pieces to the resources, the guidelines and protocols that you have available to you. They engage, these most effective teams that we've seen, engage in these 5 steps that you see and multiple times during the unit of instruction. They'll administer a pre-assessment prior to the unit, in which they use that to adjust their pacing, adjust their instruction, identify any deficits that students may have before they even get into the unit of instruction. They'll administer a formative assessment during the unit, in which they check progress of students against their goals and determine the effectiveness of their strategies to this point, and talk about any needed modifications that might be necessary to help reach the goal. And then finally, they'll administer a formative assessment towards the end of the unit to see if we're on track and if there's any last-minute tweaking or revisions or intervention that need to be delivered to ensure that all of our students are successful and reach their goals. Now, if we're going to ask our teachers to do this, we should ensure that they get some bang for their buck or return on their investment. And folks, if you haven't already seen Visible Learning for Teachers and the preceding publication, Visible Learning by John Hattie, I'd urge you to go to our website, which is www.leadandlearn.com, and check these resources out. These literally represent the most up-to-date and comprehensive analysis of research studies that is available today. In these studies, John Hattie describes an impact point or a hinge point at which we should say, yes, this is an effective practice. And that's the D equals 0.4 that you see on the screen. What Hattie realized after analyzing all of the studies in his database was that between developmental maturity, kids having more experiences, and the typical teacher impact of 1 year of instruction, our average effect size is 0.4. What he challenges us in his research to ask ourselves is not whether or not what we do works, because he says 95% of what we do in classrooms does work. The question instead, he says, should be what works best. So what we should do is select those strategies and practices that have an effect size of greater than 0.4. Now, folks, I want you to hang on to that number for just a second. 0.4 means 1 year's academic growth. This practice of formative assessment, and by that we mean teachers measuring their students' understanding of knowledge and skills and using that measurement as a reflection of the effectiveness of their own instruction, has an effect size of 0.9. Now, if you recall on the previous slide, I said 0.4 means 1 year's worth of gains. 0.9 then is greater than 2 years worth of academic gains in a single year. And so, folks, when all these pieces come together, we really begin to close gaps for those students that we serve. If you would, I'd like you to just read that quote on the screen for just a moment. Karen Chenoweth is a education reporter formerly with the New York Times who is really intrigued with schools or intrigued by schools who are serving students with high levels of poverty, highly diverse populations in terms of their demographics, and yet we're highly successful in kind of blowing the typical stereotype out of the water. And so she actually went out and visited a number of schools across the country that were beating the pattern. And in her book, It's Being Done, she shares the findings that she realized through her visits in those schools. And one of those that you see here on the screen is not only the use of interim assessments to help struggling students, but using that data to identify specific patterns, both in strengths and needs and their implications for instructional practice, so that teachers could refine what they do on a daily basis to better meet the needs of their students. So many of you have read the work of Rick DeFore and Bob Eaker and their colleagues in professional learning communities. And we've worked with many schools across the country, including in New York State, who've begun that work of professional learning communities. What they find, what they suggest, folks, is they think of themselves as professional learning communities, but they do this data teams process that we're describing when they have administered a common formative assessment and need a structure and a protocol for making instructional decisions. These data teams, these PLCs, because time is limited and very precious, should only focus on those standards that Lisa described earlier are the priority standards, or those that are most critical for our students' success. 3 criteria for identifying those standards are endurance, or standing the test of time, leverage, students' ability in this area contributes to their success in others, and readiness, or standards that students need for the next unit or next level of instruction. Only those standards that meet all 3 of those criteria should be the focus for our collaboration and our assessment in data-based inquiry teams. And what it all boils down to, folks, is analyzing the needs in order to determine instruction. And so we find that the most effective teams really identify 4 groups of students within their classes. Those kids who are already proficient at whatever the skill or standard that we're working on. Those kids who are pretty close and just need a little bit of instruction, have a small deficit that's keeping them from being proficient. Those kids that are a little bit further away but still likely to be proficient. And those kids for whom intervention is most likely necessary in order for them to be successful. What's really interesting is, as Carol Ann Tomlinson suggests, differentiation begins with data. And often beginning teams will identify the need that is the same for all 3 groups of kids who are not proficient and address that in a whole class instructional manner. What ends up happening is that they don't close gaps. And so the reality is those kids who are far but likely will share the needs of those kids who are close to proficient, but have some differences, some additional needs that keep them from being proficient. And we have to address both of those, and that's why you see the green arrows going down. There's an overlapping of needs. By the same token, those kids that are in the intervention group will often have the same needs as the far but likely and close to proficient students, and we need to address all of their needs if we're going to be successful in raising them to proficiency. What that means instructionally is that we have to select those practices in order to respond to those needs as we go through. And it's the reflection on those practices and the impact of those practices that leads us to my colleague Jack and a discussion of teacher and leader effectiveness. Jack.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Lisa, and good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning. I'd like to begin by saying that the 3rd component of our Engage New York webinar features the area of teacher and leader effectiveness. And as you well know, here in our Empire State, this past academic year, you finished your APPR plans, and now it's time to reflect on your current practices and also to plan for those necessary changes for the upcoming school year and those beyond. Those decisions are going to be critical. And we think that there is one method of model of professional development that would certainly help you. That method is called the Joyce and Showers. And really it is a four-step component. And the first step in this model is when the teacher or the presenter is going to introduce and present the new skill or strategy. The learner is going to be given the benefit of what's the theory behind this behavior and what would be the benefits for student learning. So the presenter will offer some of the insights, and a lot of that, of course, is based on experience, and he'll or she'll answer any questions that the listeners and the learners are going to be offering. Second step in the Joyce and Showers model is demonstrating or modeling. In this instance, the presenter will model or demonstrate the new skill as those audience members observe. And of course, nothing is going to be perfect, but as this particular modeling is going on, the teacher will be asking, okay, can I do this? What are some of the things that I will need to do? How can I hone my practice better? What is this gentleman or lady doing that I still need to be able to do? And so then we get to our third step in this model, and it's all about practice and feedback. The audience members now will actually practice this strategy in a simulated fashion, and it could certainly be in a training session, in a safe environment like a workshop, where the feedback is provided, and again, it's done very positively, and yet it's going to be done in terms of exactly what are the big rocks, what do we both need to do to make learning effective and teaching more effective for that particular educator. Step number 4 is now really where the rubber meets the road. This is where the teacher will actually start to do this particular type of lesson, and they will be coaching. The teacher or school leader will apply this new learning that the coach has given to him or her, and then the feedback will be there. Now, you might say, okay, are all of these steps equally important? Well, in a way. However, as we go on to our next slide, we will see that the chart really says that fourth step, namely coaching, is critical. Please, if you would, follow along with me as I briefly walk you through this particular chart. The first row, entitled Training Component, are those 4 steps we just went over. As we work our way into the presentation of theory and go over it in that particular row from left to right, what this means is that if the teachers, if there are 100 of them, if 85 of them would understand the concept if they only had the presentation of the theory, only 15% of them would actually be able to say, okay, I've got the skill, I've attained that, with just presentation of theory. Lastly, the all-important column here, application, what does it look like in the classroom? Can this be done? Only 5 to 10% of the teachers were capable of doing that. And as we see for the first 2 steps of that training component, presentation of theory and modeling, both of those are rather, passive. You're not, as a learner, doing much other than observing. But notice how it does, once you get into practice and feedback and then finally coaching, how it becomes more interactive. And as a result, you can look at that coaching row. 90% of the teachers were able to understand the concept. 90% of them were able to understand the skill and put that into practice. But when it came to actually showing it in the classroom, look at how those numbers differ from the first 3, presentation, modeling or demonstrating, and then practice and feedback. Clearly, in coaching, 80 to 90% is a drastically wonderful change that we'd all love to see. So what does this tell us? Simply, if teachers are aware and have the skills, but don't apply them in the classroom, well, then the opportunity for our students to achieve is going to be lost. At the center, we believe that for every 1 day of training, 7 days of follow-up are strongly suggested. And those numbers by Joyce and Shower, especially down the bottom right, certainly attest to that belief. Now, as we start to look at the New York Engage, one of the 2 main parts of the teacher and leader effectiveness is evaluation. Well, we as Empire State educators are totally aware of the HEDI criteria. We love to be known as highly effective, developing, ineffective. We always want to try to improve upon what we have. And we are all aware that teachers, especially now that these evaluations are coming out, we want to help teachers to attain their APPR goals. So as we start to look at it, you're probably saying, well, I know all about student learning objectives, or I want to know more about state growth measures. Looking at those principal and teacher practice rubrics, our center's professional development associations are well aware of the needs of teachers and of school leaders. We can help designing rubrics. We can certainly help with designing rigorous curriculum that's aligned to the Common Core. Your modules will be something that you can always fall back on, and we would like to hone that craft with you. We'll there too, as Tony was talking about, formative and summative assessments, because those are going to be so important to prepare not only our teachers, but also our students for the PARC assessments that will be coming our way. And as we move on to our improving practice, the second part of the EngageNY Teacher and Leader Effectiveness, the center's professional development associations are well-schooled in, well, we've been all teachers or principals, curriculum specialists, chair people, coaches. We've been through to know what works and what doesn't work. And two of the center offerings that really have been things that we're proud of, one is the Instructional Coaching Institute. And this is for grades K to 12 teachers. And it's an opportunity based somewhat on the Joyce and Showers model, and then taking off to actually compartmentalize and prioritize and fit, customize for your needs. We'll go over the theories, practices, and the most successful implementations. Another offering is dealing with demonstration lessons. We all can remember what it was like to be a new teacher. And for some of us, we perhaps didn't have the Common Core. We perhaps didn't have APPR as it is today that we had to concern ourselves with. Well, our demonstration lessons, which would include the pre and post observation conferences, feature an opportunity to work with master teachers who are well aware of what is going through young teachers and even some experienced teachers as they're preparing for the rigors of the Common Core. Recall the beauty of the swan so gracefully moving across the lake. Well, we don't really see the bottom where that swan is paddling like mad. That's what happens when we look at the Joyce and Showers model. Once the teacher tries this, the teacher will see, okay, no, I have to improve upon this, that, or the other. So when we're looking at improving practice, it deals with our very next topic, and that is teacher effectiveness. Now, perhaps the halcyon days of Norman Rockwell's teacher are well past us. And as Bob Dylan says, well, the times, they are a-changing. Lisa addressed the importance of the Common Core standards and assessments and gave us some wonderful strategies that we could certainly utilize to advance our teaching. But we well know that those strategies and more will be needed to be successful for the new Common Core standards in math, whether they're content standards or the practice standards. What does an effective function lesson look like? And as we go over to the ELA literacy side, well, what is it a good lesson when it comes to working with text-based answers? Or how about if we're looking at engaging students in a close reading? Exactly how does one do that? It looks easy, but what goes into that? And other classroom concerns, classroom management. How do we differentiate the lesson? Tony talked about the 4 strands of students. How do we make it applicable for all of our kids? What does a balanced math and science approach look like? Can we use those generic reading strategies in all subjects, or do we need to be more conscientious of exactly what goes into disciplinary literacy? What do those next generations, as Lisa was talking about, what do those next generation assessments really look like? So the PARC is on its way, and we're there to help. As we move on to our next topic, namely leader effectiveness, as we start to look here, of course, the word principal comes from principal teacher, and yet that man or that woman's role has certainly burgeoned. They're asked to do so much now, including having these characteristics and doing these tasks, as well as setting those measurable goals that will address the critical needs of not only the staff, the students, the school, but the district as well. It's a very, if you would, overwhelming process. In New York, they took notice of the Educational Leadership Policy Standards, and that particular document shared that wide vision of what is best for effective learning, management, professional growth. What do principals and school leaders really need to do? In our center's performance evaluation systems, we really have been successful with this in that it's an effective model that will customize and differentiate the professional growth for your school leaders. In addition, our performance coaching will do exactly that. These men and women bring many years of experience into that classroom to assist not only the teachers, but also the school leaders with how to better improve their practice. And as we close this particular session on our third component, this is one in which Mark Twain, generally quite humorous, yes, there's some wry humor here, but the truth is pretty overwhelming. The secret of getting ahead is getting started. Well, several years ago when we were initially hearing about the Common Core state standards, those years, 2014/2015, may have seemed light years away. Well, as we well know, the future is upon us because that will be the first year where these assessments will, so to speak, really have their full implementation. So for us, whether we're school leaders, teachers, members of the school board, or anyone associated with the district, when we make the right decisions to improve classroom and school-wide concerns, the results will be overwhelmingly positive. However, that process can be daunting. So crafting that strategic plan to meet the demands of, as you saw this year, the APPR, the Common Core State Initiative, and all the other, if you would, things that teachers are asked to do, that can be equally challenging. Know well, please, that we at the center, we're prepared to engage ourselves in the Engage New York movement. We would like to see every state administrator, teacher, student, fully prepared for these challenges, be able to grow through the experience and certainly achieve success in the process. It will be our pleasure to help you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my colleagues Lisa Sibilak and Jack Umstatter, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. As Jack said, we are here to help in any way that we can, from free resources available on our website to phone calls to on-site professional development services. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us so that we can explore manners in which we can support you as you serve the children of New York State. If you have any questions about the topics we presented to you today, please reach out to the 3 email addresses that you see there on the screen. Or if you'd like to talk about means of supporting you in your districts or in your schools, feel free to reach out to Kyle Helfrich or Katie Simons, members of our excellent account executives team at the 2 email addresses that you see there before you. Again, thank you for your time and attention today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Have a great rest of the week.